So in my last video, I covered the topic and the life and work of Theodor Herzl, who is understood to be the founder of modern political Zionism. And just a little recap on that. He's a man of the 19th century. He's secular, not religious. He is traumatized by a political event of anti-Semitism. And he sees the solution to the problem of the Jewish people in a nationalist question through European colonization, to work through the means of what was common in Europe at the time. And he made a speech about that, which I read through. And if we look at his Jewish State, his manifesto, and we look at his novella, his utopian novel, he portrays a Jewish state being created through European colonization. These are the words he uses. And his creation of a Jewish state in Palestine is going to look like a European colony and be European civilization. And so, again, this was his vision, and I pointed out he did not live to see a Jewish state. This is what he had in mind, but he's going to really take old ideas, things that weren't original, and he's going to move them forward in a way to really make Zionism an ideology that is going to be influential within the European Jewish community at the time. And so today in this video, I'm going to cover the father of the far right, Vladimir Ze'ev Jabotinsky. Now, the reason why I'm going to jump from Herzl to Jabotinsky is because currently Netanyahu and his coalition government, the Israeli prime minister and his coalition government, are almost all universally followers of Jabotinsky's ideas. And so, for example, if you were to Google and look at the Likud party, so Netanyahu, the prime minister of Israel, his party is the Likud. And if you look in the English website, it says the founder of the Likud is Jabotinsky. So Vladimir Ze'ev Jabotinsky's picture's there, and it covers a biography of him. If you look at the website of Otzma Yehudit, that's the Jewish Strength Party, the religious far-right party that's also very controversial and a part of the Netanyahu government, you will also see a picture of Jabotinsky there. The Yisrael Beiteinu party, our House of Israel party, which is a secular far-right party that's also been in Israeli politics and dominates, is openly followers of Jabotinsky. So Jabotinsky right now is a highly influential figure, and he had a version of Zionism called Revisionist Zionism, which is really simply far-right Zionism, which I'll explain a little bit more. Very important in understanding. Now, originally, the Jabotinsky wing of the Zionist camp was more marginalized in many ways. Early on in the build-up to the Zionist colonization of Palestine that would lead to the war with the Palestinians and other Arabs and the creation of the state of Israel in 1948, the Zionists that are going to play a pivotal role in creating Israel are going to be what's called labor Zionists. They're leftist Zionists. In other words, they bought into the idea that colonization was a good thing, even though the majority of the population were Arabs. And in that case, they had a status quo view of a European mentality about non-Western people that don't have a nation state with a flag, okay? But within that framework of Jewish nationalism, Zionist groups were embracing all of the ideas that were common in Europe, from liberalism to socialism, even communism, and as we're going to see with Jabotinsky, also fascism that was coming out of the far right. And so the labor Zionists that were dominating were socialists. So that's, and like I said, many were actually full-on communists. And Jabotinsky was a man who embraced far-right nationalist politics of Europe. This is well understood by anybody who's ever followed Israeli politics. It's not controversial to call him a fascist. He openly admired Mussolini, and we're going to look at his writings in detail and let his ideas speak for itself. Now, the first prime minister of Israel, Ben-Gurion, called him Vladimir Hitler. Now, remember, his first name is Vladimir, so he called him Vladimir Hitler. So then the question would be, why? How does these ultra-nationalist far-right Israelis justify embracing the ideas of a man who everybody that studies any of this, and even in Israel, would know was called Vladimir Hitler by Ben-Gurion? Well, I need to kind of address this because it's hitting. It would hit different at the time to call him Vladimir Hitler than now. But it also still leads us down the rabbit hole we need to go to try to understand the mentality of the Israeli far right and in regards to how they're treating the Palestinians and why there is a greater Israel project going on. There is going to be a deliberate ethnic cleansing project to be extended that we have to be aware of, that is all out in the open, okay? But first of all, I want to mention this. So for those who study the subject, many Israelis no doubt have heard that Ben-Gurion called Jabotinsky Vladimir Hitler. But again, here's why it hits different. This was before the Holocaust, first of all. And so now, if you call somebody a Hitler, it would be you saying that you're a rabid anti-Semite, or you're a person who just believes in ethnic cleansing, or you're this terrible... You take all the most negative things about the legacy of Hitler that you know, and you would put that onto that person saying, oh, your atrocities that you're about to commit, or that you are committing, or do you want to commit, it's very Hitlerian, right? But at the time, it's a little different. Even Jabotinsky seemed to refer to his enemy opposition as Nazi at times. Well, what was going on? Because the labor Zionists were socialists, they believed in class war, and they believed in fighting, you know, the sole interests of the bourgeoisie, if you understand anything about Marxism. And they were pro-workers, Jewish workers when it comes to Palestine, specifically, and workers' rights, supporting strikes, things like that. For the far right, unions are divisive, because what is this idea of workers versus the bosses? You're supposed to be a part of the nation state, this organic, unified nation, okay? And so for Jabotinsky, he was against socialism. He was anti-communist, anti-socialist. And he was even against a lot of strikes. He actually wrote an article, said break the strike, something about breaking a strike. And so when he was called Vladimir Hitler by Ben-Gurion, the context seems to be more or less about his nationalist, anti-socialist, anti-worker views, according to Ben-Gurion, that were similar to the Nazis, because the brown shirts, the development of Hitler's ideas, they are going to go against a union organization and things like that, what they see as divisive, anti-nationalist kind of political activity. So he's not calling Jabotinsky Vladimir Hitler because of his views towards different ethnicities or minorities or this idea of genocide. It's more or less this kind of Marxist socialist ideological battle against the more or less corporatism, economic corporatism, which is a whole other topic, and nationalism of the far right. So very violently contentious towards each other. Okay, so keep in mind, Ben-Gurion didn't even want to allow him to be buried. He died in New York, and he didn't even want him back. But it was, again, not over his views about Palestinians or things like that. It was these other ideological differences that were occurring within the Zionist world. But nonetheless, it is totally fair to to call Jabotinsky a fascist. And there has been recently an attempt, I would say, in the last few decades to rehabilitate the image of Jabotinsky. Because if you look at his autobiography and who he, like his life and his intellectual abilities, he's quite a Renaissance man. And he was born in Odessa in the Russian Empire, but he's going to travel the world, and he's going to be a man of action and a man of letters. He writes a lot of information in several different languages. He's even known to have the best translation of Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven written in modern Hebrew. And that's the pitch that some people like to kind of focus on now more than his political writings. But for the sake of this topic, when I'm covering the Israel-Palestine conflict and looking at Zionism, what I want to focus on are the words and the ideas of Jabotinsky himself. So I'm going to skip over much of the biography and just simply say a few important things. As I mentioned, he was born in Odessa, part of the Russian Empire. Like Herzl, he was secular, he was non-religious. He wrote down in his autobiography, "I had at that time no internal connection with Judaism except through the study of Hebrew," unquote. So, other than learning Hebrew, and we're going to see, he was not religious at all. And like Herzl, he is also going to have a kind of pivotal moment that really sets his Zionism ablaze. So he's already buying into the ideas of Zionism, but there were these pogroms, these violent orchestrated attacks on Jewish communities in the Russian Empire in 1903 that are going to make him feel the need to really help empower Jewish people in a militaristic way, in a militant way of self-defense, and he's going to be all in. And so I'm going to be reading actually quite a bit just out of, and bouncing around to get us a clear idea of his ideas. And I'm using the same book that I've used for a few other videos, The Making of Modern Zionism, The Intellectual Origins of the Jewish State by the Israeli scholar Shlomo Avneri. And we're going to just take a look. This is from chapter 15 for those who are interested. But in his autobiography, Jabotinsky also talks about where he's getting some of his ideas. And he says, quoting him, "If I have a spiritual homeland, it is Italy." And then he says, "More than Russia, all my views on problems of nationalism, the state, and society were developed during those years under the Italian influence." Now, he was talking about Italian nationalism prior to Mussolini. But then if you look down on page 71, he's going to start also admitting an influence, an inspiration by the fascism of the Italian far right with Mussolini. Excuse me. He says, "The new Italian is organized and orderly, meticulous in his accounts, a builder and a conqueror, obstinate and cruel. This is the first origin of fascism." Now, it seems very odd to have the word cruel and obstinate be kind of used in a positive way. Or is he using it in a positive way? Are we misunderstanding him? Well, if we look at his 1910 writing, "Man is a wolf to man," here we start to see a very kind of dark idea about humanity and civilization that Jabotinsky is going to develop. So he says here on page 172 of the Avneri book, again from "Man is a Wolf to Man," 1910, "Sometimes we base too many rosy hopes on the fallacy that a certain people has itself suffered much and will therefore feel the agony of another people and understand it, and its conscience will not allow it to inflict on the weaker people what had been earlier inflicted on it. But in reality, it appears that these are mere pretty phases. Only the Bible says," and he has the quote there, "Thou shalt not oppress a stranger, for ye know the heart of a stranger, Seeing ye were strangers in the land of Egypt, unquote. He was quoting Exodus 23:9 of the Torah, the beginning part of the Bible. And then this is what he has to say about this, referring to the Torah, the Bible. Contemporary morality has no place for such childish humanism. So here, we're seeing that Jabotinsky is saying, and he was referring to, by the way, all of the ethnic conflicts that were coming about with the rise of modern nationalism in Europe. And some people who were oppressed, and then when they got the chance, they're becoming oppressors. And then he's basically saying, this is how the world works. And this idea of treating the stranger in a strange land, a foreigner in your own country, well, there's this idea in the Torah. So here, he's basically calling the Bible, the source of his religion, a contemporary morality that has no place for such childish humanism. That's his view. Okay? Now he further states, it was a wise philosopher who said, man is a wolf to man. Worse than the wolf is man to man. And this will not change for many days to come. He then says, when I am criticized for my insistence on apartness, on not believing in anyone, and on other matters which are difficult for delicate persons to accept, I sometimes want to answer, I am guilty. Do not believe anyone. Be always on guard. Carry your stick always with you. This is the only way of surviving in this wolfish battle of all against all. So, very straightforward, cynical view about humanity, that we need to carry a stick and we need to become fighters. And you need to take care of your own. It's not hard to see, again, this development of a far-right nationalist thinking. Now, what about his views of race? After all, it's the anti-Semitism, it's the racism against Jews that is now something that is bothering someone like him rightfully. With Herzl, he was pointing out that even when Jews are no longer religiously Jewish, that they're getting persecuted for being Jewish. So we would think we want to take an anti-racist position. But notice what he says. He wrote an article on race published in 1913. And he said, it does not matter whether pure races exist or not. What matters is that ethnic communities are distinguished from each other by their racial appearance, and it is in this sense that the term race acquires a most definitive and scientific meaning. We are entitled then to say that, generally speaking, almost every nation has a specific racial component, which is common to each individual within it. In this sense, and not, of course, in a political or judicial sense, nation and race overlap each other. What follows from this? So, the idea of scientific racism that was developing at the time, he buys into. He doesn't reject this. He's accepting this as kind of the reality of the world, the way it is. And then he says further, if we look on page 175 of the Avnery book, he talks about an absolute nation, something he wants. What does this mean, absolute nation? He said, it would have to occupy from times immemorial a continuous and clearly defined piece of land. It would be highly desirable if in that area there would be no alien minorities. Who would weaken national unity? It would have to maintain an original national language which is not derived from any other nation. So, he is coming from a minority group who's getting pogromed, and he's rightfully rejecting that. But he himself is saying that he sees this ideal absolute nation to not even have any minority at all, like with somebody like himself. And again, if we look on page 176, he wrote an article in 1933 titled A Lecture on Jewish History. And he says regarding having states, he says, for this reason, every race seeks to become a state because only in its own state will it feel comfortable. So again, the world of states that are making Jewish people uncomfortable, he's basically saying this is natural and that ideally races and states do go together. Okay, this is what he's pointing out. And he's seeing, again, a very cynical view of the world. So he, in 1913, wrote a response to somebody who was anti-Semitic that wrote a tract called An Inferior Race, talking about Jews. And then he wants to attack them with words in a dialogue called An Exchange of Compliments. But in this one, he has some other telling ideas. So from this writing, and on page 177 in chapter 15, he says, the same applies to the Bushman when he will meet a white person. Ultimately, and despite everything, he will be impressed by the white man's supremacy. Both believe in their own superiority, but in the white man's heart, it will not be impaired, while in the Bushman's feeling, it will be contested and destroyed and will finally disappear. Ultimately, the white man will rule the Bushman not only by force, but his domination will also be that of spiritual superiority. Now, are we misunderstanding, not getting the context right of Jabotinsky's words? This sounds very much like any white nationalist that we would expect a neo-Nazi to have a view on the world. That's not being unfair and editorializing. I think that that's an objectively true statement. But what do we make of this if he is somebody who is going to be a minority group it's going to be a target of these groups? I mean, this is before Hitler's Holocaust, but it's also, you know, a time again where he's seeing pogroms and so forth. Well, according to Avnery, it gets stranger. We're not misreading what he's saying. Avnery points out now, this is the writings of the Israeli scholar, he says, Jabotinsky's commitment to the values of nationalism leads him to one of the more surprising positions taken by him, an endorsement of Ukrainian nationalism and its national literature. Ukrainian nationalism was characterized more than any other by an extreme xenophobia and virulent anti-Semitism. So Jabotinsky was even embracing nationalisms coming out of Ukraine that were known to be super anti-Semitic. And this is again what Avnery points out on 179. He said, at the 12th Zionist Congress convened in 1921, Jabotinsky proposed to a rather stunned audience a scheme for cooperation with the anti-communist Ukrainian independent regime of Simeon Petluria. Jews have come to identify Petluria's regime and his legions with brutal pogroms and massacres, and prior to the emergence of Hitler, the very name Petluria conjured in the Jewish mind basically the quintessential anti-Semite. And Jabotinsky's supporting him. What is going on with this kind of thinking? For a brief moment, I'm going to break away from Jabotinsky, and I'm going to go to another minority group or ethnic group that was facing suffering at the same time, and maybe give us some insight into how this is developing, this seeming to be a contradiction, that the person who's a minority group that's being oppressed is buying into the oppressor's ideas and advocating on behalf of them, even when it goes against his own people. I'm going to look at selected writings and speeches of Marcus Garvey. Now, Marcus Garvey was a black nationalist from Jamaica. And he lived at almost the exact time of Jabotinsky. In fact, they died in the same year. So Marcus Garvey was born in 1887, and then he dies in 1940. Jabotinsky the same. And he is seen as the father of Pan-Africanism and black nationalism. Now, I stumbled on these writings years ago. On page 78 of this book here, Marcus Garvey gave a speech and he said, I asked the acting imperial wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. And then he moves on. And I read this and said, wait, Marcus Garvey, the black nationalist, is talking about having a discussion that he willingly set up when he came to America to talk with the imperial wizard of the KKK. And then if you go down, he says, the Ku Klux Klan is therefore expressing the feelings and the sentiment of a large number of people in the country towards us as a race, the attitude of refusing to allow the Negro to enjoy political, economic, and social equality. So Marcus Garvey, he's buying into the idea when the Ku Klux Klan tells him that the majority of whites have this feeling that the Ku Klux Klan has, he is actually saying, okay, I buy into what the Ku Klux Klan is saying, and I'll believe that the majority of whites actually think like them. And so then this is what he says further. He goes, so I was not disturbed, I was not nervous at all, meaning being in the presence of the imperial wizard of the KKK. He goes, I was speaking to a man who was brutally a white man, and I was speaking to him as a man who was brutally a Negro. He had his interest to protect, and I had mine to protect. His one idea, his one greatest hope is to see the great white race the masters of civilization. My one dream, my one hope is to see the great black race the masters of civilization. And then he says further, so you realize that the Universal Negro Improvement Association, which he created, is carrying out just what the Ku Klux Klan is carrying out, the purity of the white race down south, and we are going to carry out our purity of the black race not only down south, but all throughout the world. So what do we make of this? Now, at the time, we've got to say that there were many black intellectuals and activists in America that were horrified and really upset with Marcus Garvey's position on talking to the KK and saying that black people have to organize like the KKK. So we see something very similar with his far-right his radical nationalism, and what we see Jabotinsky also doing this, right? Now, his legacy of Marcus Garvey is going to not be that violent, or that's a whole nother story. So we'll have to leave Marcus Garvey for a whole nother discussion on terms of his ideas and his legacy. But what I wanted to show is that here was, again, also a minority in a white supremacist world trying to understand what to do. And instead of actually saying, this power imbalance is completely wrong and we need to reject it, they're saying, okay, the real world operates in this way and we have to use it to our advantage. If whites are always going to be racist and they're going to organize themselves for their interests, then we need to organize ourselves for our interests and kind of emulate them. Jabotinsky was saying, every race creates a nation state for themselves, for their race at the expense of other races. We need to buy into this idea as well. And I thought of the writings of a Brazilian theorist, Paulo Freire, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And what he addressed is he said that when you have these power imbalances, I'm paraphrasing him, that people who are oppressed by a dominant group often buy into the logic of the system that they're oppressed into. If you're a slave, for example, justice for you would be to be a master and not a slave. You have an unfortunate lot because you're born into this terrible circumstance, or maybe you're extremely poor. But the answer, a better life for you would be to be a master or to be rich. In other words, you don't question the imbalance and say, the system that's creating this imbalance shouldn't exist. You're just on the wrong end of the power imbalance, you see. And I think that that's what really happened with Jabotinsky's, and many of the Zionists, I would argue, that they're looking at a European world of how minorities are being dealt with and race, and the very thing that is creating anti-Semitism, they're going to say, okay, well, this is how the world works. We're going to buy into it. So we see with Jabotinsky, clearly he's supporting far-right fascist groups, and he's also, so then the question is going to be, well, how does he view the Palestinians then? Do we ever see this? Because remember, with Herzl, we talked about his Rashid Bey, his token Palestinian Arab that he wants to portray as somebody who's going to benefit from Zionist colonization in his novella Old New Land. Jabotinsky wrote something very telling and very surprising, in 1927 is called the Arabesque fashion. This is on page 188 of the Avery book. He says, "We, the Jews, have no connection with that Orient of Palestine, perhaps even less than other European people. It cannot be argued that we belong to the Orient, meaning the Middle East, because we came originally from Asia. All Central Europe is full of races who also came from Asia, and at a much later period than we. All the Ashkenazi Jews," he's talking about European Jews, "and certainly half the Sephardic ones, the ones that were expelled from Spain and also ended up sometimes in Middle Eastern countries, have been resident in Europe for 2,000 years. This is sufficient long time for spiritual integration. Moreover, not only have we been resident in Europe for many generations, not only have we learnt a lot from Europe, we are also one of the peoples who have created European culture, and we are the most important creators of that culture. The spiritual atmosphere of Europe is ours. We have the same rights in it, just like the Germans and the English and the Italians and the French. And in Palestine, this creativity will continue, as Nordau, another Zionist that was contemporary with Herzl, he says, as Nordau had put it so well, we come to the land of Israel in order to push the moral frontiers of Europe up to the Euphrates." So he's arguing, right, that Jewish link to the Middle East is, no, they're not even linked. This is the different argument that you hear from a lot of pro-Israel pundits now. They want to talk about, oh, Israel, the Jews are the real indigenous people of Palestine. He's not arguing that. He's saying all Eastern European people come from Asia at some point. We've been here for 2,000 years. He's making a stronger case that they actually belong where they've been, that Jewish people, and I would agree, should have never been seen as alien residents. They were there for 2,000 years and a part of the culture, just like all the other peoples that developed parts of those areas. So he's saying, no, we're a part of this great European civilization, not the Middle Eastern backward world, even religious Jewishness by implication. Although he's not saying it, but we already saw what he thought about the Torah in a previous, discussion about the naivety, childishness of loving the stranger. And then, he's saying that we're going to push the frontiers of Europe up to the Euphrates. Now, keep in mind, even though he doesn't believe in the Bible, he wants there to be a Hebrew language, a national language, and he wants the full biblical borders, which makes him a revisionist Zionist, a little different than some of the others. Some of the other Zionists were said we need to have at least a portion of Palestine would be sufficient. He wants greater Israel. He wants what is now Gaza, parts of Jordan. I believe it would even go to the Sinai. If you look at the vision of the far right, it puts the frontier of Israel, it makes the boundaries of Israel much, much greater. Now, this is the important part to be aware of. We hear a lot about Hamas's charter that talk about wanting, this idea that the Palestinian nationalists and Islamists want to kick all the Jews out and have all of Palestine back, and we're supposed to be horrified by this kind of view coming out of Hamas. But the Likud party believes in greater Israel, this vision. All the far-right parties believe in this biblical borders, including all the parties I mentioned, from the Jewish Strength Party and so on. And their view of Palestinians as minorities are very clearly the same that Jabotinsky had. Gaza is considered Israel to the current Israeli government. It needs to be resettled by Jews. If you look at the West Bank, what's happening right now since this war that's been happening since after October 7th of this year in 2023, the settlers are not only taking more land from Palestinians in the West Bank, but the violence and the aggressiveness of the settlers pushing those frontiers with the backup of IDF is going full force. And we are seeing now comments coming out, although a lot of folks are not seeing this on the mainstream media, by Israeli far-right politicians, that they are calling for the resettlement of Gaza. They're having this Jabotinsky line of a greater Israel, of ethnic cleansing, and a total absolute nation state. Okay? And that's important to understand in terms of the fact that they're having this and getting the full backing of the U.S. government, all the military aid possible. But but we're told to focus on the Hamas version that actually is not getting all of that support, and it's a problem. So we need to just be aware of this, and keeping in mind that there are Israeli politicians who are still Zionist, who are condemning this still as a problem that's driving the peace. I believe that the former Prime Minister of Israel, Ehud Olmert, I believe, has been openly condemning this. So something to keep in mind again, talking about Jabotinsky. I could go further on page 93 where he talks about comparing the Zionists needing to get the militancy to conquer Palestine like the whites would get in Kenya. So he wrote about that. So he had all of the racist views of a European man about different ethnicities. He had contempt for the Arabs. And he was basically a person who advocated full-on dominance over Palestine. Now, if you look in some of his other writings, you'll see that he still thought that Arabs should be able to have a state, but the Jewish colonization project of Palestine was supposed to be for the advantage of the Jewish people at the disadvantage of the Arabs, and he wasn't going to have it any other way, and he understood it and was more open about it than any other Zionist thinker. I'm just going to end on covering a little bit more. Well, the computer shut down. Okay, so my laptop is froze. So what we're just going to say is this. Oh, wait, here we go. Okay, technology is always there. So he wrote another, I talked about the Iron Wall in one of his earlier writings, and he kind of expanded on that in 1941. And keep in mind that 1941 is to the buildup of creating a Jewish state. And at one time there was a talk about Uganda possibly being a place that could be used as a Jewish state. Because keep in mind, all the Zionists were aware that it was a world of European colonization. And they were really relying on other European powers to sympathize with them in context of this. I would argue if you look at the writings and you're seeing what's happening, they only could conceive of a Jewish state being created through a European-backed colonization project because that was the world that was existing then. So here's what he has to say about going into Palestine versus the idea that they had about Uganda. And it's telling. He says the simplest way out would be to look for a different country to colonize, like Uganda. So he talks about it. He says, but if we look more closely into the matter, we shall find that the same evil exists there too. Uganda also has a native population, which consciously or unconsciously, as in every other instance in history, will resist the coming of the colonizers. It is true that these natives happen to be black, but that does not alter the essential fact. So we can already see what direction he's going on in this conversation. And then he says, there are no more uninhabited islands in the world. In every oasis there is a native population settled from times immemorial who will not tolerate an immigrant majority or an invasion of outsiders. So that if there is any landless people in the world, even its dream of a national home must be an immoral dream. Those who are landless must remain landless to all eternity. The whole earth has been allocated. Basta. Morality has said so. But he's going to go on. So here's what he's saying. Well, the problems we're going to have in Palestine is everywhere else. We just have to fight. I'm going to paraphrase. His overall argument is, yeah, wherever we're going to go, there's going to be a native population that's going to resist having their land taken from them. But you know what? Some of these people have a want and we have a need. And he's going to basically say, we have to he's going to basically make an argument for the strength and the power, the cruelty, the aggressiveness of the far-right political ideologies coming out of Europe. And he's basically saying, this is what we have to do. We're acting out of necessity. That is the logic and the ideas of Jabotinsky, and there's nothing that changes in that over the legacy of his writings. So this is what Palestinians are dealing with now in power in Israel. And this is the ideology that's being backed by the US government currently. And this is something that actually is even beyond what most pro-Israeli Zionists in America, I think, are even willing to embrace when they know about it. Now, what happened if you took this secular ideology and you mixed it with religion, like Hamas, like a Jewish form of Hamas? Unfortunately, there is an example. There was a rabbi named Rabbi Meir Kahane. And Kahane is also a picture on some of these far-right Israeli groups, which I'll talk about in the next video. And for now, I think it's clear of what the problem is with the far-right.